The world, as we know it, has a voracious appetite for energy. From the cars we drive to the devices in our hands, everything needs power. So as we transition to cleaner and greener sources, where is all that energy going to come from? CNA's Teresa Tang is live at Ecosperity Week in Singapore, exploring that very question with a guest. Teresa.
That's right. Thanks very much, Jill. You know, the world right now is in the midst of a once-in-a-lifetime energy transition. And my next guest has described that transition as messy. I'm very pleased to have with me now Dr. Angela Wilkinson. She is Secretary General and CEO at the World Energy Council. Thank you so much for your time today, Angela. You know, a lot of levers are moving right now to help us get towards that green transition. But they're not really working all in concert with each other. And you've described this transition as messy. Can you elaborate why describe it that way?
So energy is a system. Behind every button, lever or fuel pump, there's a myriad of connections. Those connections are not just about technologies, they're about money and people and geographies, about hopes and fears. So when you're changing the relationship between society and energy, which is what we're doing, and when we're trying to achieve an unprecedented transition, which isn't just about decarbonisation, but is about enabling billions of better lives with wider access to more sustainable development, the energy for sustainable development, as well as climate neutrality and climate resilience, right? It's not an easy, quick fix.
We have to talk about the Russia-Ukraine war because it has amplified calls for a transition away from fossil fuels. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, has said they believe globally fossil fuel use will peak this decade. But also the war has shone a spotlight on Russia and what a large player it is in the energy space. They need to be part of this conversation too, right? Is that going to be a problem?
Let's talk. So we recently ran a global survey, the World Energy Pulse, and there were two things from that I can put into this piece. First of all is that we all know now that the world energy system isn't fit for purpose, right? We've had all these shocks, of which the European security crisis is one. Let's not forget COVID, and let's not forget the potential of global economic recession and the cost of living crisis that many countries are already feeling. And the other thing the survey shows is that everybody wants to talk about the relocalization of energy security, but at the same time, they all recognize that interdependencies are real. And even if we decouple part of the energy system from Russia, there will be new interdependencies between countries. So we have to get real about managing interdependencies. And if you want to manage interdependencies, it's better to have an attitude of not I'm right, you're wrong, but how do you not put people on the naughty step and encourage them to lead together, even though they might not agree. What's good in the interests of all of humanity and the planet can't be dictated by political borders.
Inclusion is key, clearly. Let's talk about China, India, and Pakistan. They have doubled down on their use of coal, while the rest of the world is walking away from it. If those in the global south are marching down their own energy path, how are we going to make this green transition happen? So
there's no one-size-fits-all energy transition pathway. The diversity in energy systems has been increasing for decades. Diversity in terms of technologies, resources, needs, interests, geographies, people, diversity in the broadest sense. Now, so China, India, and other countries around the world all have different starting points. They all have different levers. So they need to manage their transition, which is not just climate resilient and climate neutral, but also just and inclusive in terms of providing economic prosperity to their citizens. So no one can live on a dying planet. There's no economy on a dying planet, but a healthy planet must also enable opportunities for healthy human and economic development of billions more people.
There's a theory in psychology that argues humans are always motivated by self-interest. And the latest World Energy Report supports that notion, saying that national security interests threaten renewable energy development. How likely is a green tech arms race?
I think that economists talk a lot about self-interest and politicians talk a lot about self-interest to actually justify behaviours which aren't inherent in human DNA. Actually, economists can't understand why we cooperate with each other as fully as we do. You know, there's this notion that actually generosity and our ability to talk with strangers is fundamentally the adaptive and evolutionary DNA capability of the human race. So let's not confuse what works in markets and what works in governments with what works in communities and societies generally. In fact, I think we need to be much more inclusive, not just talking about public, private, state and market cooperation, but not forget that people and communities are also at the table.
Pardon me, I have a tickle in my throat.
Do you need water?
I do, but we'll try to carry on. Now, getting renewables to scale is an issue, right? Let's talk about batteries. A lot of mining for critical minerals is going to happen when we develop these renewable batteries. There are going to be unintended consequences on this path to net zero green energy. Where's the trade-off? How do we deal with these consequences?
Look, I wonder if we could stop calling it green energy for a start and just call it climate neutral energy, right? Because actually there are many different levers we can pull. We need to build more renewable capacity, but we can also include carbon capture and storage and nature-based solutions as part of that transition to the future, right? So that's really important. And I don't think there are unintended consequences. I think we're all pretty clear at the moment that getting the renewable revolution, power revolution to scale requires a huge amount of new materials, right? And there's a shift in industrial manufacturing and industrialization going on at the same time as we've got energy transition. So there's not energy transition happening which determines all other things. Energy transition is happening in parallel with a new industrial paradigm, in parallel with political transitions, in parallel with social transformations. And this is why it's messy, because you can't just do it by being an economist or an engineer. You've actually got to be able to engage in multi-stakeholder dialogues. You have to cooperate with people you don't agree with, and you all have to move forward because the direction is clear, even though the pathways are divergent.
If we think back to the energy transition from coal to gas in, for example, in America, there was a trail of abandoned communities. People were left jobless. So it's no surprise there is some trepidation now. So what would you tell an oil and gas worker worried about a just transition? Where do they fit in?
So that's where the concept of just and inclusive is coming from. First of all is some countries are going to continue to use coal. Can they include carbon offsets with that? Because they don't have other options. They can't not use any energy, right? For the workers in the industry, there's not just a reskilling challenge. There isn't a correspondence. Everybody talks about there'll be 40 million new jobs in renewable energy compared with 20 million jobs in fossil fuels. But they're not one-to-one jobs. They're not in the same place. They're not the same capabilities, and they're not the same pay and job rates. So very superficially, we can keep talking about big numbers, which is a very political game as far as I can see, or we can start to think together systemically about what does that mean. And my message is we can't keep talking about finance and technology moonshots, right? 11 men have been to the moon. 11 men have been to the moon. We need to start talking about how do we enable the hundreds of thousands of smaller steps, place-based, clean and just and inclusive energy transitions, which put people and communities, women and workers, as well as vulnerable and diverse community interests at the table. Cities are stepping up to the rescue, right? It's not rural villages alone. But this is the transition is, if it's not for us, if it's not for us all, then it's not for us. What's the point in having a healthy planet if we haven't got social and economic progress at the same time?
You can't leave anyone behind, definitely.
I think it's not leaving. If we don't want to leave anyone behind, to me, that's a victim story. It's like there will be these people left behind. How do we compensate them, right, so that worse doesn't happen? I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in how do we bring everyone along, because everybody has to play a role in this. Our behaviours have to change. Our norms have to change. Our mindsets have to change. We're going to have to collaborate in a new way. As I say, we're going to cooperate despite our differences because we're not going to get to a narrow consensus quickly, right? So it's bringing everyone with us. And for that, we need a new way of telling stories and helping people co-create the future. It's not about policy silos and sectoral specialities. It's a conversation about the future that involves us all in co-creating it.
Before we came on live, you described yourself as a hopeful realist. Being in the Asia Pacific, is there anything in this region particularly that makes you hopeful?
Well, this region has a growing share of the global population, right? And I believe where you've got different resources, you've got different capabilities, you've got great experiences. We need to involve and engage more people, not because it's the moral thing to do, but because the ideas are there. The capabilities need to be nurtured, and change happens from the bottom up. Every roadmap must have road builders. It's time to activate the road building.
A real pleasure having you on the program today. Thank you so much for your time. Dr. Angela Wilkinson, Secretary General and CEO of the World Energy Council.